So I was a bit surprised that nobody picked up this book. I suspect, or the reading within this book to brief, I figured that someone would. I suspect part of it is that you don't want to have to say the word obfuscation on recording because it's very easy to trip over. But we're reading from the book called Obfuscation by Finn Brunton and Helen Nissenbaum. We'll read other things by Nissenbaum. Nissenbaum at this point is, I think, sort of or at least one of the very small number of very senior scholars around issues of privacy and policy, and especially around this question of violation of contexts. So not necessarily this particular piece, but writ large, I think if you wanted to learn more about questions of privacy, especially around policy, that Nissenbaum would be a good person to look at. Brunton has also written about issues of spam and other things that are kind of technologies of obfuscation, right? And before we kind of get into this, I guess when I talked to, this is going back, I've talked about kind of these issues of privacy and surveillance for decades now, especially kind of what used to be called dataveillance, but now that's kind of gone by the wayside because all surveillance is largely dataveillance. When I talked about that, especially with undergraduates, that it can be very frustrating, right? Because there's not much you can do about it, and so the response is, I'm not gonna get a tinfoil hat and build a Faraday cage in the middle of a rental, storage space and live in that space. It's I'm not going to go all tinfoil, and so I just have to give up on it. That tends to be the response. If it's not that, there's a handful of responses, and one of them is not obfuscation is not the first one that comes to mind. And part of that is because there's this long idea that obscurity is not security. When you talk to people who talk about privacy and security, often they'll say, well, not so much privacy, but around security, they'll say that obscurity is not security. So if you go to a safe company and they say, I'm not going to tell you how I'm protecting this safe, or if you go to a lock company and they say, we can't share the internals of our lock with you, chances are that lock or that safe or that piece of software is not very secure. And the reason for that is that it relies on that privacy, it relies on that secrecy, and any system of security that relies largely or wholly on secrecy is going to fail, because if the minute somebody opens up and leaks that, it's dead. So, for example, there was a single secret code that protected DVD encryption, and as soon as that was released, the whole thing fell apart, right? So anytime you have you're basing your security around a secret piece of information, that's considered weak security. The idea is that if you open up your system, so that this goes back to the open software question, if you open your system up and let people try to crack at it, you have a better idea of how hard or easy it is to crack. So one of the reasons we might not look to obfuscation particularly is because this idea that obscurity is a fairly weak form of security. That's not really entirely true, which I'll talk about in a second. Really what it is you can't rely on obscurity alone to provide privacy or security. So that's one of these pieces. The other piece is, as I said, you could, why aren't you using Proton Mail? Why aren't you doing end-to-end encryption on everything? Some of that is you're starting to see that, right? Like a lot of sites, and especially some legislation requires this, are really pushing you towards HTTPS for web communications, which provides some end-to-end encryption, right? So there is some push towards that idea of security by default and encryption by default. And there's no question that encryption is where you're trying to, where something is encryptable, it's a useful process. But for a lot of these things, it's not even a question of the content that can be encrypted. It's a question of traffic, right? It's a question of figuring out who you're talking to or what you're doing. And that's a lot harder to encrypt. So that often people will go to kind of strong encryption as one way of approaching this. Another way is strong policy, right? Not in the U.S. U.S. has a very long tradition of having weak privacy protections. The most kind of binding privacy protection for Americans right now is companies having to adhere to European law under the GDPR. So, the Europeans have in part because of, I think, the experience with the Stasi and kind of oppressive regimes in Eastern Europe, have traditionally had pretty strong, relative to the United States, strong protections for privacy. And so often they have a ministerial level person that's a privacy ombudsman. Often there's some kinds of controls over what people can share in terms of privacy. And as I said, the GDPR is kind of an outcome of some of those expectations. In the US, I think, you probably have run into the idea of HIPAA, which protects to a certain degree your health information, or FERPA, which is supposed to protect certain kinds of school-based information. So there are some legislative attempts. And so some people say the only way we fix this is by putting the force of law behind things so that you can sue people that violate your privacy. That's a whole nother debate. As it turns out, that can be really tricky because often when you have your privacy invaded, you don't even know, or you might not care initially until it becomes an issue for you. So both of those are problematic. There's a science fiction author, actually, who has named Bryn, who has written a whole bunch of fairly popular science fiction, but also has this book called The Transparent Society, in which he argues, give up. We can't really get rid of these privacy invasions. The technology becomes more and more advanced at every stage, so we should just expect that more and more of our work, more and more of our everyday lives will be surveilled. So that the only good response is what he calls reciprocal transparency. That is, yes, we should have CCTV on every street, but it shouldn't just be in the bad neighborhoods, right? In particular, these technologies should be equally applicable to surveilling the government as they are to surveilling the citizens. In other words, you should make sure that this transparency does not only apply to the least powerful in society, but that it is applied writ large to everybody in society. There's some pretty extreme interpretations of that, but that's at least another response. I really think, if I had to give someone a toolkit for ensuring that there was some level of privacy for citizens, this thin book I would hand to them and say, read this thing. I really like the approach that they take, which is they start out with, and we've run into this in some of the other pieces, but they start out with very practical examples of what it means to create obscurity. I don't know, some of you may be ex-military or may have worked in intelligence, or may have worked, for example, for the Department of State and worked overseas, or worked for businesses overseas in places where you had to be worried about security. And so some of this is like sort of spy tradecraft stuff, but also if you've worked for a large multinational corporation or for a law firm or for anyone that has some concern over local security and issues of kidnapping, for example, if you're in places where kidnapping happens fairly frequently, they'll tell you things like, don't drive the same route to work every day, right? That's kind of a flavor of this obscurity, right? That you're trying not to provide people with information, and you just kind of change your everyday pattern. This feels like in Dune, you have to walk without the rhythm. You're trying to make yourself less predictable by either inserting false information out there or by just flooding the zone with so much stuff, with noise, that it makes it impossible for the real stuff to get teased out, or makes it much harder for the real stuff to get teased out. And this doesn't just stand. So I'll just, as an aside here, I mean, this question of finding the needle in the haystack is now a big part of what big data analysis is, right? So there are limits to how much how much noise you can put into the system, and not have it just be flushed out by some of the machine learning algorithms that we have now that look for patterns. That said, I mean, I think this is a fairly robust set of practices that then can be leveraged with other practices. And my guess is that most of you have never used pretty good protection, PGP. You've probably not used Signal or other encryption tools. And the reason is, if you talk to people, it's because I don't have anything to hide, right? The argument is that, I'm not a criminal. I am not engaged in anything that the government would be concerned about. So I don't have anything here to hide. And the problem with that is that if you believe that the government should know everything, and it's usually the government in this case, but also, especially now, big business, if you believe Facebook should know everything about everybody, then it's not then it's not a problem. But if you think that there are cases where whistleblowers, for example, should be protected, or where there is a legitimate reason for someone to want to protect their communications, if you think that that case ever exists, then you can contribute to kind of obscuring this process for everybody. So let me get more into detail about what that argument is. First of all, I'll note that early on, when people thought that the NSA or whoever was reading all of our emails, they do something called kind of keyword stuffing. So in their SIG, they would say bomb, terrorist, whatever, so that they were always flagged. So that their email, the idea was that there was a very simplistic system that was looking for these keywords and spitting them into a bin, and they would just gum up the works a little bit. So that's like one level of saying, okay, I'm never going to talk about bombs or terrorism, but I want to make it harder for those who are trying to find those cases. But this broader question of encryption is, why should I use encryption if I'm not engaged in something that needs protection? Why do I need to encrypt my note to my mom that says, please come for Thanksgiving? Because they're not going to, the NSA does not care where my mom, well, that may not be true, but the NSA doesn't really care that my mom is coming to see me for Thanksgiving, right? So why would I encrypt that message? And the argument is, for the same reason that back in the day when people sent snail mail, for the same reason you would put your mail in an envelope, right? Because it may not matter to you right now, but the idea is that if you start from the default of making it obscure, of hiding this, then that makes it easier for those who someday and it may be you, that have to rely on that hidden information. Encrypting, modern encryption systems can be very difficult to tackle, but governments and corporations now have incredible resources for analyzing cryptographic data. So if they can see that someone has encrypted something, and they know that only happens when they have something that's a valuable secret inside there, they can put their resources into trying to cryptoanalyze that message, trying to uncover what's going on there. Or it may just signal that you're doing something wrong. It may be that the minute you send an encrypted message, that kind of stands out as something that maybe you're guilty, maybe you have something. If you're encrypting something, you must have something to hide. So part of this kind of social obfuscation process is that if everybody engages in these kinds of noisy activities, if everybody kind of does protective processes for their privacy, that makes it easier for those who actually need that protection. Now, again, this is predicated on the idea that you think that there are things that should be difficult for governments and corporations to observe. I suspect that especially a lot of young people have given up on that idea, that they do not believe that there is any danger or harm in governments or corporations observing them, because they haven't in recent history they haven't felt that harm. We don't have the equivalent of the Stasi in the U.S. in recent history. So at least most of us don't. There are certainly groups in American society that have been much more heavily surveilled, and that have had that be used to their disadvantage. There's no question of that. But I think if you talk to most young people, they're like, if they want to read my stupid texts, I don't care, right? And so I think that stepping into that idea of, do you not care for you? And then do you take that a step further and say that no one should have that level of security? And so one of the things that I think they don't get into as much in here, at least in the parts that we're reading, is this argument that we should obfuscate not just for ourselves, but as a social practice for protecting the separating out and protecting a public space that is not kind of incurred upon by corporations and by governments. We don't really need to do that by putting armed guards at the doors of restaurants, right? No police or business people allowed in or something like that. But the equivalent of that is kind of our online communications and our electronic communications now. And so the question is, can we create noisy restaurants? Can we create spaces in which it's more difficult to pick out people that might have something to hide? Can we contribute to the space in which privacy isn't protected by hard walls, by things that have to be analyzed or broken into by locks, but they're protected by a crowd? Can we create privacy through that sort of warm social embrace of noise. And I think that's a really interesting idea, and I think that they present it in a really interesting way in the book and in the sections that you read. If you're interested in that, I do. It's a fairly inexpensive thing to pick up used, and you might want to pick it up and read through it. All right, thanks.